who know the rent control and the rent stabilization system. Rent stabilization and rent control is enormously complex. And you are not going to be able to fathom and understand all of your rights simply by reading your lease and going online and checking out your status. You need help. So I recommend very, very strongly that you connect with an organization staffed with advocates who know the system, and they will guide you. Kalante is one, for instance, and Met Council on Housing. Just go online and enter in Metropolitan Council on Housing. You'll see the phone number, and they will assist you and steer you. It's a not-for-profit organization. They have no agenda other than advancing the interests and rights of regulated tenants in New York City. Now, I'd like to say a word about the rent stabilization system and the rent control laws. Rent control, incidentally, started immediately after World War II, when there was a massive housing crisis in the United States, and cities throughout the country had rent regulation, usually called rent control. Big urban centers especially had rent regulation. New York City's rent control system ended in 1970. Still, to this day, there are approximately 30,000 units in New York City that are still subject to the rent control laws. And they make rent stabilization look simple. That is vastly complex, vastly more complex than rent stabilization. And so there are a few, I won't call them experts, but we'll say there are a few advocates in the city who are sufficiently familiar with rent control to guide you. Even the staff at DHCR is mystified often by rent control rules. But most, I would gather most of you are rent-stabilized tenants. And there are a few things that I want to say to you now, and I hope you have a pencil and paper out. So you will take a number down, 718-739-6400. 739-6400. That is DHCR's public access number, and I want every one of you to call and ask the person at the other end of the line to mail your rent history, your rent registration history, because that is the starting point to understand your status with respect to your landlord, with respect to your status as rent stabilized, and your rent. Yes, indeed, you can come here also and produce some ID with your address on it, and the staff here at 125th Street, also down in Lower City, in Lower Manhattan at 25 Beaver Street, that staff will also supply you with a rent history. Yes? Okay. It will go back to 1984. In 1984 is when the state legislature mandated that every landlord with a rent-stabilized tenant in its building must register with the state. The state agency is called the Division of Housing and Community Renewal, shorthand DHCR. And that agency is supposed to maintain information about each tenant who is stabilized, the lease term, the length of the lease, and the rent. That information that the state has is supplied by the landlord. So often it is fictional. It is not accurate. Often it is. because as a matter of law, the owner is obligated to supply the information that is correct. But you'll notice when you get your rent registration history, there is a disclaimer at the bottom of the page that says this is merely information that the owner has supplied to the DHCR, and we're relaying it to you. Yes, you have your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to know, am I supposed to receive a copy of the registration here from the landlord?
Are you supposed to what?
Receive a copy of the registration.
Annually, that's another good point. But
I have never, in 20 years, I have never seen one.
But get your registration history. If you're not getting, I should add this, annually you should get a registration statement from the owner. And it will contain the information that eventually gets on your registration history. And if you're not getting one in the mail annually, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have a registration history that reflects your circumstances in your lease. And that sends up a flag in your circumstances. Are you stabilized? If the owner is not registering you and sending a registration to you, there is a question about whether the owner perceives that you are a stabilized tenant. So you need to get that clarified and start with a registration history from DHCR and then get to someone to give you some guidance. Yes, the question is there any retroactivity if you were to move out of an apartment, you learn that you were being overcharged and you have moved? How does the DHCR know where you are? It doesn't. You have to notify the DHCR, but you also are entitled to file an overcharge complaint and demonstrate that you were a tenant during a period of time. This is what I paid. I am filing an overcharge complaint. Now you have to go online to get or come here or down to 25 Beaver Street to get an overcharge complaint form. Read the instructions, supply the information, and make a copy of the lease, your original lease, the renewals, proof of your rent payments, and then say, I believe I was overcharged. You will compel the owner to respond to your complaint. And if it can't justify the rent that it was charging you, you should be entitled to an overcharge, a judgment in your favor. That's the beginning of the process because there are appeals that automatically stay the collectability of it, and then you would have a tough row to hoe because even if you're successful, you will have to get a judgment. You can't just take it from the rent at that point. You have to get a judgment, record the judgment, and then enforce it. So it's a heavy load, but if the volume of the overcharge is enough, you can hire a lawyer to do it, and he'll take a piece of it. John Borman. I don't do that end of that business. You get a garden variety lawyer for that. Yes, sir. It makes no difference who your landlord is currently. They all stand in the same set of shoes with the same obligations and duties as its predecessor. Yes? Oh, the question is, and this is a common designation on your rent history. You'll be reading along. Let's assume you moved in 2 years ago and you get your rent history, and it shows from 1984 up till 2000 tenants' names and leases and rents. And then in 2000, there's an entry, high rent exemption. High rent deregulation. And there...
Regular exemption, like if people were there, family members
Oh, well, you're getting into nuanced stuff, but this is the more common picture where you'll see in your registration history, exempt, high rent. The landlord is claiming that you presently are not subject to rent regulation because the unit had been exempted because the rent had climbed through the years over $2,000 prior to 2001, and then after 2001, $2,500, and now it's $2,700 after 2015. So you have to look at that history, and that's the deeply complex part of understanding the registration history and your rights. That's when you have to get to an organization that can give you guidance, because so many of these instances, owners are trying to increase the rent to get to the threshold where it is no longer regulated, and then it can charge whatever the market will bear. It could charge you $3,000, $3,500. It could charge you $1,500. It makes no difference. You would be deregulated, and the owner can do whatever it wishes. And if it wants you out, it merely has to give you a termination notice, and you're out. So it's vital that you get that registration history, and I call it get it audited by someone who knows how to read the document. Moreover, there are cases out. In fact, there are 2 cases going to the High Court of the state, which could have a profound effect on hosts of tenants who occupy apartments where the owner previously claimed that they were deregulated. And it's a complex legal interpretation of a statute that had conflicting lower court decisions. Now the case is making its way to the High Court of the state. You may hear the word and, of course, the name Altshuler. It's called the Altshuler case, and we're all watching it very closely. The landlord industry is petrified of this decision, whether the High Court will interpret the law to say you automatically do not deregulate an apartment if you are entitled to charge over $2,000 or over $25,000 or $27,000. The preceding tenant absolutely had to be charged over $2,000, and that would be the only set of circumstances where the unit would be deregulated. So much of the fraud that goes on in rent stabilization occurs when you get a tenant, you look at your rent history, and the rent is growing in, 1988, 1999, it's in the vicinity of $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, and then in about 2005, you may see the rent at $1,500. That's really at the cusp, because the owner is on the verge. If you're out, or if your predecessor is out, they can add 20% automatically. How do they get from $1,800, that's the 15 plus 20, to $2,000 to deregulate? Of course, they claim, I made many, many improvements, really expensive improvements, thus I was entitled to charge over $2,000, and the unit is deregulated. All of that, there is so much fraud involved in these phantom and fictional improvements, and tenants are always challenging those improvements, and it's hard to do it, and you need help. You need to contact Ferrante, other organizations who are advocates to guide you through that process. And you can't just idly file an overcharge complaint and say, there was a fraud. The owner claimed these improvements. Because the state agency, the DHCR, without more, will reject your claim of fraud. And it's a very tough standard to meet. So you have to come up with something. Now, this Altshuler case, Altman case, there's another case, Altshuler, which is really important, it has to do with J51. But Altman really does create another avenue for examining your rent history and seeing whether currently you are stabilized or maybe there had been a significant overcharge. So we have to be watchful. I think with respect to the effectiveness of the Altman case, it's going to be massive, but our chances of prevailing on it, I think, are about 50-50. Yes, ma'am?
Where do you find someone who can audit rent history?
Palante, Met Council on Housing, there are other organizations. Call Keith Wright, call Rosalba, they know where to send you. Indeed, they know a lot, but they're not exclusively involved in these questions, but they'll know where to send you for guidance. Yeah.
Telephone fraud or DHCR are complicated. And I know a lot of people have said to me they couldn't deal with the menu, press 1, press 3. If you get the right history, you press 1 and 7.
Did you hear that? I was told it was 5. Okay.
And by chance anyone gets confused with the prompts, whatever clerk picks up, say, I want my right history, and they will take care of it. But don't fail to pursue.
Okay. Did everyone hear that? This is a vital piece of information. If you're going to get your rent history by calling the DHCR, the 718 number, you're going to be given a menu of prompts. And the key is hit 1, correct me, and then 7. And then you'll be steered directly to the source of getting your rent history. The alternative.
You have to use the prompts. Whoever picks up, take time to be on the phone. Say, I want my rent history.
Yeah.
And get the name of the person so they'll do it.
Okay. And the other piece of it, of course, when you call and you wait, you labor through all the entire menu, you finally get a human being on the other end of the line. Say, I want my rent history. I am the tenant of this apartment. It will be mailed to the apartment. However, if you come down here, you must have ID with the address on it. Someone has over here. You were in an HDFC. Well, that's a different bowl of wax. Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. Not subject to rent stabilization. HDFCs are exempt from rent stabilization. There are some special cases where it's grafted on by virtue of the regulatory agreement, but so yes, ma'am. Right. I'll get to this. All right, she is introducing another area of substantial complexity, and it has to do with succession rights. Succession rights involve a person who is a relative or a close person closely connected to the tenant of record. And the tenant of record either dies, moves on permanently, and what happens to the family, friend, associate who remains in the apartment after the tenant of record has departed permanently. And that person is entitled to, we call it, succeed to the tenancy of the tenant of record. And succession rights often are automatically recognized, I won't say automatically, but routinely recognized by landlords if he knows or it knows the family, but most often not so. Okay. I was just told that there is going to be a special session on succession rights. Oh, okay. So I won't go into too much detail, but I want to add something, and I'm sure this is going to be covered in the afternoon session on succession rights. If someone is leaving, has died, or on the verge of moving out, that is the critical juncture at which you notify the landlord that the tenant of record is gone. And don't have that person, let's say they moved out, moved to California, don't mail the lease out to them to sign it. Okay, let's move on to a different topic. Last year, keep me posted. I'm going to be covering this stuff. Right here, sir. 718-739-6400. What? Yeah. Okay. Wait a second. You say the name loud.
Louder.
It makes no difference who committed the overcharge. The former owner, current owner. The current owner is responsible for the acts of its predecessor. So, is that the extent of your question? Yeah. You're in public housing, so I'm going. Oh yes, over here they've had our hand up.
For the lunch session that they have here, can you put that in the corner for the crowd to ask questions?
The question has to do with preferential rents. And this is another area that's enormously complex. Often, if an owner is entitled to charge an amount, a legal rent, for sake of discussion, of $1,700, but because of the market, it can't get $1,700. And so you say, I'll rent the place for $1,500. And so you have on your lease, the legal rent for this apartment is $1,700, but I'm going to rent it to you for $1,500. Then the question is, someone said rider, a rider to the lease. And often there is a rider to the lease that spells out the terms and conditions of the preferential rent. And if that rider says, this preferential rent is for this lease and this lease only, and it shall end, let's say it's a 2-year lease, 2 years hence. And the owner, in effect, in so many words, says, I will, at that point, be at liberty to charge the full legal rent plus any guidelines increases. So you have a preferential rent of a relatively short duration. And so you get into court over, let's assume there are subsequent renewals with the $1,500 rent, and both rents are being increased. Then it becomes an issue of, well, how does a court interpret whether this is an enduring preferential rent for the entire length of the tenancy until you move out?
But unfortunately, my mother passed away. I was living in Puerto Rico. When she died, they had a mission in Turkey.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they sold the building and just leased it up on the 30th. And they were supposed to be letting me 90 days prior. And they just did it all next week, all before the in Florida. And they just did it. That was wrong the same way. I've been complaining, and that's what pissed them off. I'm handicapped, and I don't have a brain.
All right. Now, but where does the preferential rent enter the picture?
Well, when my mother passed away in 2013, they did a
Renewal.
which expired. They switched my name.
They gave you a new lease, a full lease?
I have it here.
I mean, these are one of these more difficult cases that, for general discussion may not. You have something to add on this point?
Yes,
You'll have to speak up.
yes.
I don't know what to say.
Will freeze the rent at the level that it was before. So you have to when you find out about the degree, we're talking.
Well, I think the point, here's the question, I'll explain it briefly. She has gotten she is entitled to succeed her mother as the tenant of record. What I don't know is whether, I gathered from what she was saying, the owner may have given her a new entire lease in her name with guidelines, more than guide, maybe a vacancy increase, maybe a simple renewal. Is it a simple renewal that you were given?
With the same rider.
With a preferential rent rider. I'll have to look at it to fathom it. But the point is, I think the point this person was making was that if the owner fails to give you a renewal lease, and it's due, your lease ends, for sake of discussion, July 31st, the owner has not supplied you with a renewal lease, it penalizes itself. It does not get an increase until it gives you a renewal lease, and it must be given to you no less than 90 days before its commencement date. So if today the owner says, gosh, his lease is going to expire in July 31, I better get out a renewal. Well, the renewal cannot be retroactive. It's got to be given 90 days before the commencement of the renewal period. So you count 90 days from today. Today is the 16th. We go July 16th, August 16th, September 16th. The commencement date will be October 1. So you avoid any increase, and the renewal cannot commence until October 1, 2016. We don't know exactly what the guidelines increases are going to be at that time. They are now 0 and 2%, and there may be a total freeze. So you may avoid the 2% renewal. So let's take a look at what the guidelines are, and you'll execute a renewal lease, and if they were, let's for sake of discussion, say they're 5 and 7%, you're still entitled to the 0 and 2 because the owner was late. So owners penalize themselves in not sending out renewal leases. Just pay your rent. You know what you've been currently paying. It doesn't sound as if you'll be penalized. You have your. Oh, wait a second. He's had his hand up for a long time. One before you. Yeah. Well, let me boil this down. The question has to be that or his question is, am I entitled to a receipt for the payment of the rent? And he is indeed, even if he pays by check and he has a record of it on his bank statement, he is still entitled to a receipt. The owner is obligated under the code to produce the receipt. It doesn't?
No, because what he's doing, my current indicator price is 77. The new lease says 28. When I get my new lease next year, it will go to 29. So I'm being charged for 1 year.
Okay. I think that entails some strategizing to position you well. Over here, ma'am, you can your hand up. Yeah.
For my family members, I want to know, new taxes, they have a right to question you about your bank statement, knowing your co-payment history from the pharmacy, and things of that nature. That's one of the new tactics that is happening.
Well, wait a second. Who's asking this and when?
Landlord.
I know. When? Are you applying for an apartment?
No, or in an apartment.
Okay, well that's simple. Everyone can answer that. That's not a question. Everyone will answer that. Can the landlord do that? Please tell her. She seems not to understand. Everyone ask them. Okay, next. Okay, ma'am, please sit down. It's too simple. Okay.
Somebody needs to hear that.
Yeah. No, it can't. Let me see your rent history. I could use this as make a graphic for everyone.
Excuse me, can I be attention real quick? If you have any more questions, please make a line on this side and come to this mic.
Okay, when you call DHCR and the 718 number, or come here, you will get a document that looks like this. And then it shows the history through the years. These are the registrations that are occurring through the year. May I reveal some of the details here? And so it starts in 1984, and the owner wrote, the DHCR wrote, we never received a registration history, or filing, rather, for the 84 through 1997, and then in 1998, and then bam, 1999, it says that it was vacant, no explanation, and then in 2000, Randy Davis, are you Randy? Okay, Randy Davis, a predecessor, moved in with a rent of $1,100. And through the years, the rent with Randy had been renewed, the leases have been renewed with guideline increases going on till, let me get to current history, it proceeds on up to 2015, and that's where your history ends. You're not Randy. And you signed a lease in 2015. When in 2015? October 2015. And was your rent in excess of $2,700? No, you're stabilized. The owner has failed to register. Well, you're stabilized. And the question is, the language turns on the language of the preferential rent rider. And if it says it's good for 1 year only, at the end of the year, the owner could say, okay, you're stabilized, but your rent next renewal will be based on the $1,900 figure. And you're stabilized nonetheless. Okay, there you go. Yes? Oh, over there. You have to go over here. Hey, you bet. You got a quota.
How long, once you file a claim, do you hear back from DHCR?
An overcharge complaint, alas, it feels endless. It really does. And we in this field recommend, if you can, to litigate these in court.
Not housing court, but that would be.
Well, it can be in housing court in the context of a non-payment proceeding. If you want to occasion a non-payment proceeding by withholding your rent, then the owner will sue you in housing court. You can counterclaim in that context. The other alternative is to commence an action in Supreme Court for damages, and then you can get a better brand of justice, frankly, but it's not quite affordable. DHCR, I've often characterize it as a 46-cent lawsuit because you put a stamp on an envelope and post it, and thereafter the agency processes the claim. Now, I didn't mean to demean the processing of overcharge complaint with DHCR. It's simply slow, and often there are legal features to an overcharge case that have been predetermined by, as a matter of policy, by the DHCR as determinative. There's the well-known Boyd case. The Boyd case had to do with a woman who moved into a stabilized apartment that was deregulated because of improvements made, alleged improvements made to the apartment she moved into, and she filed an overcharge complaint with the DHCR in order to bump the rent from the prior tenant's rent plus the vacancy allowance, which was approximately 20%. To get over the $2,000 threshold for deregulation, I believe the owner had to put in about $40,000 worth of improvements. And, into the apartment. Just to the apartment. Now, if he had an MCI order for building-wide improvements, he could tack that on also. But we're talking about a relatively straightforward case. This Boyd went out and priced every screw, nail, cabinet, and came up with an argument that this stuff couldn't have cost more than $12,000 or $13,000. So the owner couldn't possibly justify the $40,000 expenditure bumping the rent over the threshold. The agency, DHCR, ruled against her, and I've always said that it appears that often the agency said, hey, the owner got screwed by his contractor. He was wildly overcharged because the owner produced a canceled check for $40,000, and so he spent the money ostensibly. Now, absent any uncovering of fraud there, where the work was done on two apartments contemporaneously by the same contractor or something of that nature, the agency said, tough darts, the owner gets credit for the $40,000, thus your unit is deregulated. A trial judge reviewing the agency's decision said, it smells, it emits a bad odor, and wanted it sent back. And then it went up on appeal, and the appellate level court reversed, and then the high court endorsed the middle level of appellate court's decision. So the agency has a low level of tolerance for owners' representations about the value of the improvements that they make. And I've run into this on 3 occasions where they simply accepted the owner's representation. They have evidence, obviously, of the improvement. They have a canceled check. They have a contract stamp paid. So it's a tough road to hoe. If you're in court before a judge and you do not go to the agency and you challenge it in that context, you'll get a trial judge who will cast a cooler eye on the evidence, and you may get better results. But it's more costly, and you're hiring a private attorney. Legal aid and legal services, I understand, will not tackle those cases because they're focusing on preserving, keeping people in their units largely. So it requires hiring someone to do it.
Does it matter if the case is a rent control case versus a rent stabilization if you try to bring it as a non-pay versus going straight to DHCR? Do you see the plus or minus for your side?
The question was whether or not rent control or rent stabilization. Rent control is a different horse, a different color. 10 minutes? That's it. Pardon me?
The owner, with the documentation regarding the increases, how long do they have to keep that? Because they have to turn it over to DHCR. So DHCR has those copies, rather than the owner all of a sudden being able to produce them.
Well, they don't produce it to the DHCR when they do the work on the changeover. They have to maintain those records, and if there is a lawsuit, they have to produce them. But DHCR doesn't look at them, nor does it maintain those records, unless there's an overcharge complaint, and then the owner has to produce it. Then you run into the 4-year rule, and the 4-year rule says, we are not going to examine any rent events predating 4 years from the filing of your complaint. And in order to overcome that 4-year rule, to get examination of earlier events, you have to come up with fraud. And it's a difficult standard to overcome the fraud test. It's a difficult test. I mean, Tori, I'll take a couple more questions. We can chat more afterwards.
You did answer one of my questions, but I'm one of the few rent control tenants. It's a session right, so it's complicated a little bit. After, are you going, because I have a question on a lease, I really don't understand it, it's for someone else. Afterwards, would you be able to sit down to review the lease? Because this lease is very strange.
Okay, but first let me clear up something. There are no renewal leases in rent control.
No, this is for somebody else.
Okay, you have a rent control question.
Yes.
Okay, let's
No,
do.
I have a rent control apartment. I'm one of the few, but I have a question on someone else who doesn't speak. I'm wondering if afterwards we can sit down with someone to review this lease.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maria Taveras. My question is, I live in a rent-stabilized apartment, but my question is about J51. Many of our tenants are leaving because they're being bought out, or paid off to leave, and they live life. So we have a lot of new people coming in paying market rate, but through the rent registrations we found a J51. How do you treat that? So many people paying market rate with a J51.
This is one of the obscene scandals in recent history, and it is. Tell me, does anybody know what J51 means?
Yeah.
All right. When an owner, in order to induce owners to improve their properties, the city extends to them a break on their real property taxes. So if an owner spends an enormous amount of money on the building, gussying it up, improving it, they can get an MCI, major capital improvement rent increase, and pass it on to the tenants. In addition, they can apply for a decrease in the assessment of the property because they made improvements. Ordinarily, when your property is improved, the assessor looks out, we're going to increase the assessment, which in turn increases your taxes. In addition, there are exemptions for certain kind of work where the city induces owners to improve. We'll give you an exemption for taxes for a period of time. That provision, that inducement, is generally called the J51 tax abatement. And it's not precisely the code number, but that's the shorthand we all use. The condition or quid pro quo of getting a J51 is that every tenant in that building is rent stabilized, whether he or she is paying $5,000 a month or $500 a month. It makes no difference. Everyone is rent regulated. And I was consulting with some tenants on 110th Street where they have rents that were in the range of $4,000 a month or $3,800 a month. And this brassy landlord who has a J51 on the building, and all these people are rent regulated, instead of behaving correctly, is increasing their rents by 50 and 60% in order to get them out. And people are they're walking out of the building saying, I cannot afford this. They are rent regulated. And their increases, all of their rents probably are illegal at the outset, and they are stabilized, and these 40 and 50% increases are wholly unlawful. It's shocking what this owner is doing. It's such a brassy, aggressive. Pardon me? Well,
if you don't pay this amount of money, we're gonna take you to court and throw you out.
sure, but you know, they don't want to get in court because the tenant probably will talk to a lawyer and you can just dial up on the website and see whether the building has a J51 and then bingo. A couple of years ago, I had a case here. I talked to a family who were in court in an eviction case. And she showed me her rent history, and I said, oh, gee, you know, I see the rent history going through, and it looks like legally the rent did climb to over $2,000, so the owner can evict you. It doesn't look like an overcharge. I said, but wait a second. Pulled out my phone, went online, looked at the J51 listability. I said, your building has a J51. Now, the J51 ended in 2010. If you are there for a nanosecond as a tenant with a lease, you are stabilized even if it ends a month later, a year later, or 2 years later. You are forever stabilized. It's like being a little bit pregnant. You're there for a moment, and and so you are stabilized, and indeed they get a rent rollback, and they have stabilized leases. So this is the kind of stuff where you need someone who is resourceful enough to know where to look for J51 status, because you are all stabilized. And you should not give in to these threats.
Paying, say, $4,000 because they just changed their whole apartment. They just got renovated.
Yeah.
And let's say they pay a substantial amount of money and they can prove that they spend, I don't know, $100,000 and
Right.
they can bring it out into market rate. Though subject to a J51, does it go back to the previous rent registration number, or is it?
Well, the previous rent registration number is the starting point, and it's a new tenant. The owner gets, let's assume he gets a 20% increase, and then he makes, for sake of discussion, $40,000 worth of bona fide improvements. He can add $1,000 to that base rent. It may or may not reach $4,000. It probably doesn't reach the $4,000, but let's assume it does. It's so massive at $4,000. So the outer threshold, $2,700 now, doesn't deregulate if you have an initial rent over 27 if the building has a J51 in place. Well, it's immaterial when it expires. If it expired before the commencement of this tenancy, this little example you had, if it expired before, no, they wouldn't be the beneficiary of the cap or the regulation that bars deregulation. Okay. One more, I gather. Yes, ma'am.
Ahora hay una pregunta que yo. Mi pregunta es: el dueño ya no me quiere firmar el lease.
So let me ask a couple of questions. Did you have a lease at any time? Okay. And when was the most recent renewal? When did it end? June 1st? You mean May 31st, 2016? Your lease ended? And what is your rent? $1,800 a month. And how big is the building? Well, how many? Does it have more than 6 units? That's not. It has more than 6 units in the building. Okay. Presumptively, your rent stabilized. If the owner fails to give you a renewal lease, has no impact on your rights. You continue paying the former rent. he doesn't get a rent increase until he gives you a renewal lease, which can't start for 90 days minimum. So you have, on the strength of what you've told me, you have little to be concerned about. But there may be other features to the case if it's an HDFC or if it's owned by a charitable organization. There are other wrinkles. But generally speaking, it's safe to say that you remain rent regulated and should just pay the former rent. Moreover, get a rent history because that $1,800 may be unlawful. Okay?
Yes.
Oh, because they have to define that it is not a permanent. If they are silent and they just say your rent is $1,500, you sign a lease, you're $1,500, even though the legal rent is higher. So they have to express both rents in the initial lease, the legal rent and the preferential rent. So then, if it's just silent, you can infer that it's a permanent. It's permanent. So they always put a rider on.
Why not giving me the legal right in the first place? Why not giving me the legal right?
Sir, they did. Yeah, I'll have to see your lease to give you a better answer. Last question.
Hi, I have two quick questions. I live in New York City housing, okay, and they didn't give me my rent renewal. They raised my rent in January. I didn't get it until April, and they raised my rent $528. So I took some proof once again that my daughter doesn't live with me. I don't get any income from her because she's taking welfare. She lives in a shelter.
Let me interrupt you. This is New York City Housing Authority, and we're talking about stabilization here. You should attend the session for NYCHA issues, and it has to do with recalculation of the rent because of the family composition due to your recertification. Then there's an internal process at NYCHA for review of the correct rent, and I think you can get a more informed have a more informed discussion when you talk about it upstairs.
Yeah, what time is that? Right now.
Now, there you go. Okay. That is, unless the landlord had, the question was, I gather this woman lives in an apartment building where the owner took a vacant apartment that was composed of, what, 2 bedrooms? 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, 1 bath, knocked down the walls and created, in effect, cubicles to rent to students or converted to an SRO. That's a violation of the buildings code, and it's a violation of zoning. And now, its impact on you, other than having your building cluttered with a bunch of transients, is not direct. It's a violation of the certificate of occupancy, because the certificate of occupancy says these have to be Class A units. The buildings department would never approve that kind of alteration, so it was an illegal alteration. You call DOB and say, I want an inspection. We have an illegal apartment here. If there's an inspection, they'll tell the owner to discontinue the use of this space. it's illegally constructed, and they'll direct them to legalize it immediately. Its impact on you is not going to be direct, mainly because of a violation of the certificate of occupancy. Often that means if it had to do with your apartment, you don't have to pay rent. But if it's your neighbor's apartment, it won't. It doesn't mean that you don't continue to have an obligation to pay rent. It may have an impact on the habitability of your building, meaning under the warranty of habitability, the livability of your building has been diminished, and that may entitle you to some kind of abatement, but it doesn't have a direct impact on the lawfulness of your rent. But it is an illegal act by the owner, and the DOB would be, Department of Buildings would be interested in it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That was the last question, so to go short. But right now, we're going to have successor rights. The workshop successor rights is going to be here. If you register for the workshop, just stay here. If you have another workshop, all the other workshops are up on floor number 8. So we're going to schedule, we have a room number. And also, if you have more legal questions, there is some lawyers on the 8th floor. You can sit down and watch them.